All right, we are live. Thank you for joining us again, and sorry about the slight delay in getting started there. I was running a little bit behind, but we're good to go now. Today we're going to be continuing our series looking at the pre-Islamic history of Arabia. Specifically, we're going to be asking this question: who are the Arabs, or where do the Arabs come from? Not something that is seen in polemics all that often. But it is something that is very important to the Muslim mindset. I see that RM, who was in the chat and I had a good talk with on Saturday, is back today. Why don't religious people see their belief in God as a theory? It is unproven. But according to him, you can't prove anything, so everything is just a theory, as if that somehow invalidates it. I found this quite ironic when he said, uh, I tried to talk about the Big Bang, and he said that's just a theory, because this is exactly the kind of criticism that Christians get when they say that evolution is just a theory. Totally misunderstands what a scientific theory is. It is the best explanation for the evidence that we have available today. And just like Christianity is the best explanation for the evidence that we have available to us. You can't prove anything with absolute 100% certainty, I suppose. You can't even prove that you exist. RM can't prove that he is a sentient being that has thoughts. But the rational thing to do is go with the evidence, go with what the best explanation for the evidence is. And today, we're going to be looking at some of the evidence for uh, pre-Islamic Arabia, seeing where the people groups come from. And hint, hint, the Arabs do not come from Mecca, despite the Islamic narrative about Abraham setting up the Kaaba, or depending on what you read, perhaps Adam setting it up. Very confused as to who did, but supposedly this is where the Arab people come from, and well, we're going to see that's not really the case. Anything you want to say as an introduction, Mary?
I just unplugged my own headset. It's just then. All right. So today, the introduction will be there's a really odd Islamic polemic that seems to be very common in the Muslim world. And that is that Islam has to be true because it is so unheard of that semi barbarian uneducated, illiterate, semi nomadic types of people might possibly take over an empire. But in reality, this is like one of the most common patterns that there is. It is far more common that barbarians of some sort came in and overtook a country and wiped out the civilization that was there, or just took over the whole thing and became the rulers, than it is for one great empire to be destroyed by another great empire. It is far, I there are not a huge number of times that one great empire destroys another, where they were both powerful empires at the time, and they clash, 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 clash until one overtakes the other. That's very, very rare. Instead, what you see is a pattern where somebody small or unexpected comes in and sweeps across, even whenever you have established kingdoms against each other. That's just way more common. And very common is that barbarians overtake and establish kingdoms. So, yes, exactly, Milosh. We are going to talk about the Medes and Mitanni right now. If you will bring up my.
Well, maybe in 30 seconds or a minute, because I did want to say something
Oh,
about
go
that.
ahead.
It seems to be a very common pattern in Islam where they try to diminish Muhammad, they try to diminish the Arab people, make them look like a bunch of idiots. You should believe in Muhammad because he's incapable of doing anything, and thus it's miraculous that he did something. But when we got to this point in my secular world history class, not 1% critical of Islam, they just said that this is a perfectly ordinary thing, right? That there was an area just outside the organized powers that was kind of neglected, was allowed to develop because the two empires in the vicinity, they didn't think of it as a threat, and thus they're battling each other, weakening each other, and it was just a natural occurrence that an Islamic empire arose. Indeed, one could easily suggest, I don't think Mary's going to suggest this today. Well, she definitely won't today. I don't think she will anywhere in the series, but one could easily suggest that a secular empire developed first and then a religion was tacked onto it to justify it. So for Muslims to give this as some kind of evidence for the truth of Islam is rather silly, totally ignorant of human history in general.
Yep. So I'm going to take a more detailed view of the Middle East. We're going to look at 3 areas total, I think. I believe that's what I put on here, and only the Middle East in any like fine grained way because it's just too exhausting to go through everything. So these are times in the Middle East whenever nomadic or semi-illiterate or less, would be considered barbarians by the ones who got taken over, managed to take over an area. The first one that must have happened was actually before writing was common at all, when writing was just in its bare beginnings of development. So we don't know exactly when it happened. But Kish is very clearly originally a Sumerian city, but by the time it enters history, it has Akkadian rulers and it's speaking the Akkadian language. So it's already been taken over by and these are Semites also. So the Semitic peoples who are barbarians who came in and took it over and became one of the powerful areas of Kish. And Kish established hegemony. Hegemony. It's going to be hard for me to talk today because I've been 24 hours without sleep. Sorry, guys. Hegemony over Sumer for various times during the kind of Nippur period, where if you controlled the city of Nippur, you basically had the kingship for all of Sumer. And Kish had the kingship a number of times. We also have the Gutians, which ended the Akkadian Empire. Notice Akkadian Empire from these guys, all right? Sargon of Akkad from these guys who had been previously illiterates and nomads. These Gutians came in and they were nomadic invaders, and they were so illiterate and incompetent that they were not able to figure out things like maintaining irrigation canals. And so they were quickly overthrown by the next group who could figure these things out, who were the Amorites. And they invaded from the west, another Semitic people. We have no idea what the Gutians were, by the way. The Kassites, who were probably also another Semitic tribe, they came in and they founded the first Sealand dynasty, and then they ruled Mesopotamia as one of the Babylonian dynasties, sort of, but it depends on how you count what Babylon is, right? Then the Mitanni empires, they were the first Indo-Iranians, the first Indo-European horse nomads. So these guys were proper mounted nomadic barbarians who did not have any written language, came in, swept over the Hurrian kingdoms, which were, so you have the Fertile Crescent, right? And just above that was where the Hurrian peoples, they were one of the Caucasian folks, right? Came in, wiped them out, and took them, or wiped out the superstructure, took them over, and became the rulers. The Israelites, of course, were another example. Yes, Moses was educated. He had, he could write and read, and I'm sure there were other people who could read as well, but they were still a nomadic people that were much less developed than the peoples that they took over. Then we have the Phrygians. The Phrygians are most likely Indo-European from Europe, most likely not already in Anatolia. They came across Thrace. They invaded the Hittite Empire into Anatolia. That's the funny thumb that you get, right? Then you have the Sumerians. These are more horse nomads who are like the Scythians, and they're up there way in the plains above Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. They're way up there, and they come around, and they also invade a bunch of places, and they take over different spots, including central Anatolia. We also have the Celts. The Celts made it all the way over there. That's what Galatia was an invasion of these very barbarian Celts who at that time didn't have reading and writing whenever they took over there. The Aramaeans and Chaldeans, they, my timeline's kind of skewed here, but they had previously gone across and they were the basis of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. And the Chaldeans settled so firmly there that the place called Chaldea actually changed. It had been in the north, in the northwest, but then it became like at the outlet of the Euphrates and Tigris River. Then you have the Medes. The Medes were so ignorant and barbarian that they never wrote anything down, so we don't know much about them. They're the first of the proper kind of Persian-y people, but we don't really know anything about them because they didn't have writing system even as they were ruling. They ruled without writing. And the Achaemenid, see again, don't sleep for 24 hours, you can't talk. But anyway, those Persians who are considered the true first proper Persians because they were from Fars, the actual satrapy out there in Iran that is called Persia proper, right? They came in. They also didn't have a written language at that time, but once they got there, they're like, we've got to use some kind of writing to govern this whole thing. Let's use Aramaic. Everybody's speaking that. Aramaic, a language of another group of invaders, folks. So after Alexander the Great swept in, you don't really have this pattern in the ancient Near East anymore very often because virtually everyone was able to read and write anywhere around there at that time. There were very few people who couldn't. There's also the fact that here, back. Let me see if I can.
This is the best advertisement for Islam that's ever existed in the world.
Yeah. Apparently, it is the best advertisement for Islam to exist if we do something that literally tons and tons of people have done before. And I'm not even going to go through all the conquest dynasties that there were in China. So a conquest dynasty in China is considered to be a dynasty that is not a Chinese people group, but instead is from one of the surrounding barbarian peoples who are mostly nomadic folks, like the Xianbei were a nomadic confederation, probably, or not entirely sure what they are, but probably Mongolic, possibly. No one's entirely sure what they were, I think. They may have been different things. But who controlled or took over and ruled parts of what is considered properly China. This is a list of all these different dynasties that were not Chinese and were from invaders who came in at different times. You notice that there are different dates. These are different groups of invaders who came in and took off big chunks of China, and sometimes all of China, and ruled it. For example, the Mongols, who formed the largest empire that has ever existed even to this date, were one of these kingdoms. So the Jurchen were a very major one. They had the Jin dynasty, which was pretty much the only game in town at that time. The Mongol dynasty, which had the Yuan dynasty. And then, of course, the Manchu dynasty. They're Manchurians, and they were, again, nomadic barbarians. These folks were not Chinese, and yet in the Xiongnu were Han. Xiongnu is just like the modern way of pronouncing this character. In the past, it was more like Hanu, but I don't know what the tone was then. I don't know if anybody knows. But anyway, it was the old way of pronouncing it. But all of these people, just look at the numbers of dynasties that weren't Chinese. And you want to tell me that it's like some sort of super special and unique thing that the Arabs were able to take over an area. It really wasn't. It wasn't unique at all. So here is my Last
So
little list. So go ahead.
yeah, well, real quick, we have a comment from OK Mate. How did the Quran know about Mesopotamian gods? It wasn't in the Bible. It shows Quran is miraculous. Well,
What?
I don't know what gods he thinks are in the Quran.
Well, there are a lot of gods, but they're the wrong ones and they're not Mesopotamian. They're all local. They're all from Yemen. Like all
I
the
also
gods that are listed in the Quran are ones that were worshipped in the Yemen and already in the Hijaz. They they didn't know about the proper names of Mesopotamian gods. That's part of the problem. That's one of the things they got wrong, and we'll get to that eventually, by the way. So, thank you for
I,
pointing out another flaw of the Quran.
I also don't know how knowing something about the past would be miraculous.
I
The
think
past
that,
has happened, therefore it's not miraculous to know knowledge of the past. Just saying.
well, I think that he's thinking that it accurately says what the gods at the time of Noah were, which it doesn't. These are all very recent, much more recent, like in the wrong place in the wrong time, but they're told, but Muslims are told, hey, look, it has these ancient gods' names. How did they know? Well, actually, it's the wrong gods. Even if you want to say it was ancient Mesopotamia, they're quite recent gods. They don't go back that far.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I did ask him where the Quran supposedly talks about these gods, and he didn't answer me. At least hasn't yet. Milish says all time high score confused comment. I would have to I agree with that. And apologetics says any type of knowledge is miraculous. Don't you know this, Thaddeus? All right, let's continue on.
all right. So here are times when the semi-monadic barbarians took over kingdoms in Europe. And we have the Huns, the Vandals. I didn't relist the Mongols. The Mongols also got into what is considered Europe, European Russia stuff, but I didn't relist them. But the Huns, the Vandals, who are also a mixture of Germanic peoples, and the Alans, who are another Indo-Iranian uh, crazy group, and the Vandals. The Vandals, we call people Vandals now for a reason. The Vandals were just complete psychos. Like they killed everyone, including their own siblings and relatives and stuff. Completely psycho. The Visigoths, the Goths, different than the Visigoths. The Franks, there were different tribes of Franks that fought against each other. The Angles and Saxons and Jutes who came in, they're all different peoples, but the invasion happened at the same time. The invasion of Scotland from the Gaelic, Scotland and England from Ireland. The Irish invaded, and they're the last people in the world you would imagine would invade any place successfully, because back then the Irish were so behind everyone else, it wasn't even funny. The Norse, of course, were very successful uh, raiders and conquerors. They actually established their own kingdom in southern Italy. A lot of people don't know that, as well as taking over Normandy, which is still named after them to this day. Um, the Hungarians were fairly recent invaders to what's now called Hungary. Magyars is more of their own self name. And then, of course, the Golden Horde. If you ever hear of hordes of people, or hordes of this, or hordes of that, it actually comes from the transliteration of their name for themselves in Turkic. Uh, Horde is just a transliteration. So anytime you talk about a horde, you're talking about the Golden Horde. Anytime you're talking about Vandals, it traces back to those Vandals there. So these were very influential folks. Tamerlane, of course, was another example of a conqueror. I listed him alone because people recognize his name rather than his group's name. So this is an incredibly common pattern in history that that these unsettled people are able to knock down, take over, knock out very powerful groups of people. These people over here, the first list there took out the Roman Empire in the West, completely destroyed it, guys. Like, done. So, uh, that is so unexpected from how incredibly powerful the Western Roman Empire was. I can just the astonishment of people when this actually happened was overwhelming to the people who lived at that time. They thought it was the end of the world because no one could imagine that anything like this could happen. So, in the light of history, there is nothing exceptional about the takeover of or the expansion of the Arab polity coming out of the Hijaz. It's less exceptional than Alexander the Great, for instance. So I just needed to start out by kind of busting that little myth at the beginning because it's something like I had actually heard people talk about this, a bunch of people, um, but it's uh, it's just something that's so ridiculous that I just haven't taken it seriously. But there are so many people who come from Islamic countries who take it so seriously that I felt I had to address it. And yes, the Sea Peoples are another really great example of people who took over stuff, but it's the Philistines are the ones who really made a lasting impression. Most of the rest didn't last. And since they were sea based without too much land empires, they kind of fell below my threshold of including. But you can continue to think of other peoples who kind of fit this bill too, because it is so incredibly common. And in fact, until the machine gun, the invention of the machine gun was what finally made nomadic horse barbarians no longer a threat to civilization. Until that moment, a nomadic horse barbarian group could take over a civilization just ridiculously easily if they stopped fighting with each other for like 5 seconds, which they usually didn't. And that's really what saves civilization is that barbarians, it's very hard to get them to cooperate a lot of times. And Muhammad, just like when the Genghis Khan was very good at getting everyone together and to cooperate, and so he was incredibly successful. Muhammad was successful in that same way. So
So Chris says the lack of any support of Islam is astounding. I couldn't remain a Muslim if I knew how bad it was. And I think that, even though you're saying that you didn't even treat this argument seriously, I would say it's probably actually about the best argument they have from a legitimate. That isn't a lie, that isn't totally made up. The spread of Islam, while certainly not miraculous, is at least some kind of evidence that it could have been backed by God. Whereas all the other things they generally say are just flat out lies. So I still think it's possibly the best evidence they have, even if it's not even good enough to take seriously. So there you go.
yeah, and then my last example, because they want to put, well, maybe it has to be a religious group or something. I just had to throw in Vedic India as one last example, because of course the entire idea of Hinduism hinges on this idea that these barbarians came in and destroyed and took over and mastered the settled civilized people who were there. Um, these barbarians who only had oral poetry and oral uh, religious texts that they kept only in their memories for many, many hundreds of years after taking over. So that was my last example because that amused me so much. So
A
if
very good introduction there, and I'm sure that all of the Muslims are proud of that
And we're proud of that.
because it totally supports the truth of their one and only truthful apologetic. So
yeah, and it's kind of interesting what a skewed kind of history you apparently get whenever you're in Islamic schools. So we had talked before about Neolithic stone worship. And right now we're taking a historic detour to find the Arabs in Mecca. To find Arabs, you need to find the actual human beings, right, who are going to be the Arabs. And then you also have to find the language Arabic. Right now we're focusing on the people and not the language. So that's what we're doing now. So when we had left off, the Bronze Age collapse had marked the change of regimes. So previously, they had palace economies that were very centralized, didn't have much use for money because so much of the control of money was in the hands, or the control of goods was in the hands of the palace elite. Um, and that caused, or that opened the door to the founding of Israel, massive movements of the West Semites into Sumer and Babylon, sweeping away the old regime. And so now that there was a place for money, it began to be used. It wasn't stamped coins, but like weights of gold and things like that. Then at this time, also the dromedary camel, that's the one hump camel, became used much more widely, spread very rapidly at this point. And the true, well, not spice routes, I don't know why I write that, the incense route was established between the Yemeni states, which really started to become powerful then, and to the north. And around the same time, Ethiopia was colonized by Semites from the area of Yemen. Okay. Then the Assyrians rose again, took over almost all significant areas of the ancient Near East, including destroying Israel and making Judah a client kingdom and conquering Egypt. Now, whenever Babylon rose, it says, we are the legitimate rulers because we are the true heirs of Sumer and we honor all the old gods. And look, we even build the temple in Nippur. And our god Marduk, he's really just the son of this other important god. And this other important god thought he was so cool that he went into retirement. And we're all part of the same tradition, the same history. So we're totally legit. The Assyrians said, we're legit because we'll kill you if you say we're not. So you walk through the halls of an Assyrian palace, and what do you see? You see walls of like decapitated enemies. You see the king stabbing lions. You see people, and one king's groveling before the Assyrian king, and then their piled bodies stacked up. So the Assyrians, their reputation that they depended on was their ruthlessness to anyone who crossed them at all. So that's part of the reason why the destruction of Israel by the Assyrians was so complete and so terrible, right? So, we're talking now about the period between about 700 to 550 BC. This is where you really start to see kind of the beginnings of the Arabs emerge as well. We had talked before about these various languages. And at this time, pretty much all of these languages had established themselves. Akkadian was dead as a language already. Some of these were rapidly dying as languages up here. Eblite had been wiped out by people. And even Babylonian is on its way out because remember, these Aramaeans are coming in and sweeping in and invading and taking over where Babylonia used to be with their own language, which is not the same as the Babylonian Amorite language. So during this time, you get the heavy contacts between the old South Arabian folks here and the people who will be Arabs, which cause language flow between the two groups. And so they influence each other heavily. And that influences the old South Arabian languages away from the Ethiopic languages. So modern South Arabian languages are just as old. They're just an omen. So they don't, Oman, so they don't get wiped out whenever the Yemeni languages get wiped out. So yes, Arabic is from Central Semitic, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. It isn't actually Arabic at this point right now, but it will become Arabic eventually. So as the Assyrians were coming through, Israelites fled away from Assyria as it was invading into Egypt. And it was one of a number of motives for one of the Assyrian kings to conquer Egypt, because the Assyrians were so mad at what the people from Israel, those Israelites, not the Israelites in Judah, but what the people in Israel had done. They wanted to utterly destroy them. And so they came all the way to the very southern edge of Egypt on the Elephantine, uh, uh, which is this huge island in the middle of the Nile, right before the first cataracts, beyond which you can't flow. They fled all the way as far south in Egypt as you could be and still be in Egypt to run away from the Assyrians, some of them. And they still got attacked. A lot of them wiped out. Other ones managed to flee into the wilderness and just escape the slaughter and then regroup later and escape the absolute slaughter. But the Assyrians did not play around when you made them very angry. So during this time, prophecies against many were made and very quickly fulfilled afterwards. Oh, by the way, I want everyone to notice the kingdom of Urartu, which is Ararat in the Bible. So whenever Muslims think that Mount Ararat is down in the Hijaz, no, there's an actual kingdom with this name, and it's the mountains around it also have this name, and that's where it's talking about, not some place like nearly 2,000 miles to the south by road. Or it's crazy that people will make those kinds of claims whenever it's an established place, like everybody knew where it was, right? So if you, as we move on, as the Neo-Babylonian Empire was centered around Babylon, it was those Aramaeans who had invaded there, right? And also ruled by Chaldeans who actually spread out from there. And they managed to take over the southern part of that empire from the Neo-Assyrians. And then from there, it spread out across most of the Fertile Crescent, but wasn't able to make it into Egypt. Egypt broke away and got free. Now, at the same time that this happened, up north, the Medes were coming in. Remember, we talked about them being one of those barbaric peoples. They never learned to write, so we don't really know much about them. Like, they don't even leave monuments saying, the king so-and-so did such and such. We have nothing from them because they were like, writing, who needs it? We can rule an empire without it. Not for very long, as it turns out. But they swept in and took over the entire northern portion and a bunch more. And they established what would become, there'd be a series of Iranian, now we often call them Persian kingdoms after that point. But they were the first of this series. So they're like proto-Persia, you might say, right? So the Medes are actually related to the Kurds later on. So if people are Kurdish, then their language at least descends from the Medes, although they may be more related to genetically to other people who are already there, right? And they took over the Assyrian capital, and after that, it was pretty much all over for the Assyrians. So the Neo-Babylonian Empire was able to expand quite a bit, and it took over farther south than any of the countries had ever taken over before. And this is Dedan, or what was that? Al-Ula, I think. Tema, which is in the Islamic sources too. And guess what Yathribu is? It's Yathrib, right? So that's Medina down there. It went all the way, it probably went as far south as Medina because that was the farthest south place of any significance at this time. So there's really a whole lot of nothing between Yathrib and Yemen at this time. There's nothing really there to conquer. That's why they didn't bother going any farther south, because there's nothing there to take over that anybody wants. So
hey, that's exactly what they said in my history class that I referred to earlier, is that
yeah,
everyone just ignored it because there was nothing of value there.
Yeah, there was like nothing there. Like there's stuff way down south in Yemen, but then there's a whole lot of nothing in between. Who wants it? Who wants to fight nomads over this worthless area, right?
So some quick comic relief here from Clyde the JW. I thought the Kurds were related to the Ways, aren't they? That's
Nice.
so bad. That's so bad. I had to
That's
read
so
that.
bad.
And
Nice.
Informed Infidel says to strike fear into the like button. I,
Yep.
I I think you should definitely do that. And if it does, if it, just yelling at it doesn't work and it doesn't get afraid, then you got to slap it.
Yep. So whenever you see these kind of big beardy dudes, the really big beardy dudes are usually the Babylonians. Um, so next, we have so there's this uh, ethnically Chaldean usurper who claimed various things, but let's forget about what he claimed. But he wanted to get rid of Marduk and bring in Sin. Now, Marduk had been kind of the legit god of Babylon for a really long time, because I remember that I told you the Babylonians said, "Oh, our god Marduk, he was the son of so and so, and then the old god retired, and now he's the head god," and everybody's like, "Okay, yeah, sure, that's fine." But they weren't so okay that sure that's fine at replacing him with Sin. Sin is the god of the moon, which was a more traditional kind of uh, more primitive Semitic god, and they wanted to go back to the moon god over Marduk. And everybody else said, no, we like Marduk. And so that was one of the reasons that folks did not like him at that time. That actually became a pretext for our next folks to invade, who will be the Persian Empire, the true Persians, who rebelled against the Medes and the little governor of a little piece of Persia, and then they rebelled against their overlords and then took over them and everybody else and took over like half the world. But we will talk about them later. It's kind of in this context that the Arabs really emerge. First, though, we're going to talk about the Jewish diaspora. So this was this
So
first.
before
Go ahead.
before you go on to a new subject, got a couple quick total refutations from the Muslims. Wad
Mm-hmm.
says, "Please, your fallacious, get to your fallacious arguments as fast as possible. You're boring me."
Oh, poor
And
thing.
yeah, and I said that he was bored
I will
by
not.
information
Yes, I will
always
not.
because he doesn't want to think or learn anything. So,
I am not Allah. I do not hasten to do the bidding of false prophets. So,
and then Nur says the Quran is the truth, and you have nothing but mere assertions without decisive, tangible archaeological proofs. Whereas we have that with regards to the New Testament that falsifies it. I'm very curious what archaeological proofs you have that falsify the New Testament. Of course, it's just empty rhetoric. You have no idea
yeah,
what you're talking about. You have
none.
no idea what we're talking about. You just come in here to spam comments that never ever indicate you're listening. Weird.
Yep. So, the big first event of the Jewish diaspora, the first time you have large numbers of Jews who have left the Jewish heartland, right, and have settled elsewhere and formed colonies elsewhere, was because of the Assyrians destroying Israel, causing the 10 lost tribes, and all the rest of that, right? And when that happened, they went to a whole bunch of different places. It happened now, and then the Babylonian Empire. During the Babylonian Empire, Judah also falls, and a number of people are forcibly removed from Judah, taken into captivity in Babylon, and some people stay behind. It's not the whole of the people, it's all of their leaders are taken away. But a lot of the common people who have the means also just leave. They go elsewhere. And so we have the people who are forcibly taken to Babylon, but we also have people who choose to go elsewhere. And establish uh, they established colonies and Jewish populations that will continue to be in this place for hundreds or even thousands of years later. And so, like when the folks from the Babylonian exile are allowed to return to Jerusalem, not everyone returns. There are still Jews in Babylon, like 1,000 years after the Babylonian exile. So there are Jews in all sorts of places starting at this point. Now, here's another really dumb arguments of Muslims. They ask, why were there Jews in Medina if they weren't looking for another prophet from Mecca. Well, first of all, why on earth would they be in Medina and not in Mecca if they were looking for a prophet in Mecca? If that's why they're there. They're there because Medina was a good place for trade. They were also in Tama. Tama was Jewish long before Medina was, um, and it later became not Jewish anymore. But it was another area that it was so Jewish that to live there, some of the Arab tribes had to convert to Judaism just to stay there because the Jews had so thoroughly taken it over that you couldn't live there unless you were Jewish. So the idea, Jews, by the time of Muhammad, there were Jewish colonies in India. If you ask me, what are Jews doing in Medina? You have to first answer the question, why are there Jews in India? Why are there Jews in Germany? Why are there Jews in Spain? Why are there Jews in, uh, in North Africa? Like, why are Jews in any of these places, folks? It's because the diaspora had occurred and different colonies of Jews settled in all kinds of different places. And eventually there would be Jewish colonies in China, folks, in China. So now we're going to discover like where the Arabs came from and how they became Arabs, so to speak. What does Arab even come from? Why are they called that? So if you look at the Bible, you actually get uh, three different uh, lineages in different places, two of which are actually together. The sons of Ham and the sons of Shem are put together in the same passage. And you also have the sons of Abraham all being associated with people who are in the Arabian Peninsula in some way, like or anywhere near there, right? So these very interestingly kind of reflect, if you understand, and here's the interesting thing. The Arabs of Muhammad's day did not know how to read a Bronze Age lineage like this. They thought that these were individual people being referred to here. But they are not, and they can't be. And let me show you why. The sons of Rama are Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Joktan, Sheba, we get Sheba again, and we get Havilah. Then we get sons of Jokshan, who is from Abraham, totally different lineage, Sheba and Dedan again. And we get Havilah up here as a son of Cush. This aren't referring to individual people, but rather tribal groupings. And they're referring to them not as coming from a single person, but according to their ethnic affiliations, their identities, their alliances and lineages. So we have different we actually can find now these layers at these different depths of history in the genetic and archaeological and linguistic histories and can understand what's being said very clearly here, right? So we had talked about the Circum-Arabian nomadic pastoral complex, which brought the Afro-Asiatic language to various places. And that is what the sons of Ham are being assigned to that particular migration. And Shem is being distanced from that as being more associated essentially with the civilizations of Mesopotamia and those areas. But they also contributed a second layer. This is essentially a more Semitic layer on top of that. So Afro-Asiatic at the bottom, Semitic layered on top of that, and then finally the layer on top of that are these nomadic groups that include people who will eventually be living in the area where they're identified as Arabs, but include a whole bunch of other people as well. So we can see these three languages, we can see them in the genetic and then the linguistic layers and everything else. So Nur is a girl's name. Nur should be a girl, guys.
You didn't have to answer the chat on that. I can
Yeah, I
hint.
know. But people are getting really confused about Nur. um,
Anyway, since you
so,
paused, we'll take a super chat
yep, go
here
ahead.
from Nick's Highlander.
Who ate the apple? You ate the apple. The whole apple. Yes, the whole apple. You ate it. But a small seed, you left it. You put it back into the earth. What happened? Allah, through His power, caused that to grow and to give you how many apples? Thousands.
Enjoy your apples, Nick's Highlander. Thank you for the donation.
Thousands of apples. Very important.
Thousands. Yes.
So we have some records about two particular outside of the Bible. Some of them are obvious, like the Neobaoth are the Nabateans, right? The Kedar are the Kedarites, but the ones, Duma is a city. All the ones that are bold are ones that we can identify pretty decently where we think they are. Sometimes like down to the very spot, right? Because we know where Dayton is, we know where Sheba is, we know where these places are. Duma, for instance. But Josephus records that Abraham contrived to settle them, meaning his other sons, the sons who were not having the inheritance with Isaac, to settle them in colonies. They took possession of the troglodytes in the country of Arabia the Happy as far as it reaches the Red Sea. Troglodytes just means cave dwellers. They're talking about Hegra and about Petra, where people dug into rock to live inside of the living rock. So that makes them cave dwellers. Down to Arabia the Happy. At that time, Arabia was called a much larger area than it originally was, which is Yemen. So from that area is where he said that they eventually took possession, the descendants of Abraham. But this was not Ishmael alone. Notice he had a second wife named Keturah that, like, Muslims just have no idea about, and had 7 sons from Keturah, right? A whole bunch of sons from from his second wife after Sarah, because Hagar was never a wife, and only one from Hagar. Ishmael was one of 8 who were not Isaac. So if you say, oh, Muhammad definitely came bodily from one of them, then the chances that it would be our buddy Ishmael seem to be pretty low on the whole, right? Given your odds here. On Atha, whatever his name is. Anyway, is mentioned as owning many dromedaries and mentioned next to spice and gold trade from Sheba in Isaiah 66. So if you're going to have somebody, if you're going to have anybody being the one to be the trader from Sheba, the only one mentioned to be that person is this guy, Ephah. Goodness. Anyway, it's not a name that anybody ever says. Have you ever heard that name said aloud?
No, I don't. Well, I mean, I probably have when reading through the whole Bible, but because I have listened to it on audiobook. But I've never heard anyone talk about that individual specifically. But normally in Muslim exegesis, if you can call it that, anywhere the Bible mentions camels, there's a very good chance it's talking about Muhammad. So I think that you just proved where Muhammad's ancestors come from.
Yeah, it's also the only tribe of the Midianites that's mentioned by anyone outside the Bible, which is by the Assyrians. The Assyrians mentioned these guys too. So that's why we have some idea of where they are, because the Assyrians kind of talk about where they are and what they're doing. So this is from Genesis 10, the approximate location of some of the table of nations. Some of the things are wrong, like Put's wrong. Put should be down there in Ethiopia, but the rest are fine on this one, even though it's missing a couple of places. But this kind of gives you an idea of the ideas that are being put forward there. And by the way, the Hittites are multiple peoples. They were taken over by Indo-Europeans who took over the name of the people who were already there, and didn't keep their own name, and so it's a little bit confusing. But they are multiple peoples. If you're talking about actual descent, go by Hittite, who are quite different. It's just the way people identify each other, right? So here is a map over in the top left. I could not find anywhere a map that showed where the patriarchs in the Bible, that's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Esau, even our buddy Ishmael, where they were running around and doing things. And also showed like Yemen. Nobody has that map. Why don't they have that map? Because it's so far away that what Abraham was doing had literally nothing to do with Mecca. So Mecca is 750 miles from the farthest south place that our buddy Abraham ever got to, outside of Egypt proper, right? That he could have gone from that place down to Mecca. Beersheba is as far south of as he or Jacob got to, and that's 750 miles as a crow flies, or 1,200 kilometers. It's 1,000 miles approximately if you go by roads that would eventually exist. So this is not a place where you're headed back and forth. He was nowhere ever near it. This is as far as his sum total travels ever were, basically. You count him crisscrossing up and down over periods of many, many years. So
So I have some bad news for you, Mary. Nur has given her final comment. We are still doing the same assertions, and we have nothing except wild, unproven, and even improbable scenarios, just like our mentor Jay Smith does.
Well, let's
Goodbye.
let's
hold
talk
on,
about what's improbable. Go ahead.
All of you guys have got your tails between your legs, walking away.
You gotta give me time to do the sound effects.
Sorry.
Yeah. So everything you've said, Ed, is except for the minor connection to the Bible, is just like standard history that you would find in any history class. Yet nerds obviously not paying any attention to anything and says that it's a wild assertion, unproven, even though nothing you've said thus far anyway has anything to do with the truth of Islam. Strange, isn't it?
Yeah, well, what's really funny is that according to Nur, right, what is speculative, wild, and unproven is the idea that Abraham's journeys, which were very carefully described and never mentioned going beyond these points, what is wild and speculative unproven is that these did not involve him suddenly taking a 1,000-mile detour out of the way and coming back for literally no reason in the world. There is no reason to go down there. There's nothing down there at the time, because remember, we're back with Abraham. This is before the incense trade was really established. There's nothing down there south of Khaybar really, like at all. Why? What's he doing? Why is he going there? Just like wandering around. Hey, let's go into these big mountains where it hardly ever rains. There's 4 inches of rain a year. Let's 100 centimeters for you guys who don't use freedom units, right? Let's wander up there where there's almost no food for the animals for no reason at all. It's just ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. But that saying that he did not do these maybe he had the barak, right? Maybe they're all teleporting.
And it's not open to debate, so there's no point in opening that up. But
Continue. Just ignore me.
Just a side note for Mechanique in the comments. So in Jerusalem was ruled by Hurrians for a while, but those Hurrians are identified as Hittites in the Bible. They're kind of lumped together with Hittites, though they weren't ruling at the time they came back out again. But because they were actually kind of mixed up with the Hattic people at that point. So the Hurrians, who were themselves mixed up with the Mitanni, then mixed up some more with these Hattic peoples. And so the Bible just calls all of them Hittites because in the Levant, that was like what people thought they were, essentially.
So one other humorous comment from, so you Abduls don't like history because Allah knows the breast, only the big one.
And we're proud of that.
Nice. So we want to identify the people called Arabs because even the name Arab is super important in the Islamic sources, because remember that the Quran is revealed in pure Arabiya, and so we need to know what this language is, and we need to know who these people are who speak it. So
yeah, especially since they're the best of all people.
Yeah, they're the best of all people, so we need to know who they are. So there's this area called the Arabah, which is mentioned in the Torah. And this is the late date of the Exodus. I have reasons for the late date. I'm not going to fight with anybody on it, but I'm just giving the late date of the Exodus. And this is mentioned regularly in the Torah as a location. It is very clearly, it's east of the Jordan River. It means a steppe or a desert plain. And this word changes slightly and becomes Arab in the later books. It's especially mentioned as part of Moab, like the plain of Moab is called the Arab of Moab, right? And we have, and then later on, we get some mentioning of some folks who are from kind of that area in the east, who appear to fit kind of they're in the area of what's translated as Arabia, basically. They're in that area. They're from that area. They are and they're called the Amalekites, the Midianites. And again, Midian is one of those peoples. And all the people of the east, they're coming from the east, who come with many camels. Here's something that's interesting. The kings of Midian are described in this way. And Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were where? On the necks of their camels. And later on, and Gideon said to them, let me make a request of you, every one of you give me the earrings of your spoil, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. Something that you find very commonly with these people are earrings and also crescent ornaments on the necks of the camels. So in Ibn Ashaq, we find Abu Talib say that in one of the poems that are ascribed to him, he probably didn't say it, talking about what's happening in Mecca is that there are camels marked on the shoulder or neck. You see amulets on them and alabaster ornaments bound on their necks like date-bearing branches. So again, you have ornaments on camel necks, which shows a cultural continuity from this group of Midianites, right? The Muslim scholars in the early era would try to invent false etymologies, making the word about how awesome the Arabs are in various ways. All of these are false. The word is probably not even originally Semitic. It's probably borrowed from more ancient people because it's the name of a place that was there and was probably originally named by people who weren't even Semitic. So there is a famous prophecy in Jeremiah. The Muslims, for some reason, really like using the prophecies that seem kind of positive about Arabia, but never like the ones that seem negative. Very odd. Don't you think, Thaddeus, that that's amazing?
Well, sometimes they do like the negative ones
But they don't know they're
too.
negative. They don't think they're.
Right. Well, yeah, I'm thinking specifically of Isaiah, where they're like, "Oh, this is a prophecy of Muhammad conquering Mecca," and it's actually about God condemning Arabia. But whichever.
Yeah, that's kind of what we're going to look at now, because there are passages that talk about judgment and then restoration. And a lot of times they like to render the restoration and then ignore the judgment bits. But this one talks about all the people who are going to have terrible, awful things happen to them. So, who's going to suffer? Jerusalem, cities of Judah, Pharaoh, um, all uh, all the mixed tribes in Egypt, because in certain areas of Egypt there were other people settled there, right? All the kings of the land of Uz and the kings of the land of the Philistines, Edom, Moab, the sons of Ammon, all the kings of Tyre, the kings of Sidon. All of this is Phoenicia now. We're in Tyre, Sidon, the kings of the coastland across the sea. That is probably Cyprus and the uh, Dedan, Tema, Buz. Dedan, Tema, and Buz, these are in the areas of what now we call Arabia. It's farther to the south of uh, what was called Arabia at that time, which is this northern portion of land, right? But it's where these nomadic tribes that would later be called Arabs and settled oases are, right? And all who cut the corners of their hair. So one of the most important things that Muslims are supposed to do whenever they finish their Hajj is that they cut their hair. That was also a pagan ritual, and they did it at other shrines, not just at Mecca. So there were groups of people who would not cut their hair at Mecca, but preferred to do it at a different nearby shrine. And this is in the Book of Idols by Al-Kalbi. So the kings of Zimri, or excuse me, the kings of Arabia and the kings of the mixed tribes who dwell in the desert. So this is talking about the same region, Arabia and the desert. That's this Hara in Jordan and the surrounding areas. So again, this is a mixed tribes. It's not people all from one group. The kings of Zimri, Elam, Media. So the Medes are under condemnation too. Then the king of Babylon shall drink at last and come under judgment. This is talking about a number of different things that happened from about 700 to 530 BC. So we know how the Assyrians first conquered a whole bunch of the ancient Near East, and the Babylonians came and conquered a bunch, and then finally the the Medes came, conquered a bunch, and the Persians came over and conquered the Medes. The Achaemenid Persians came and conquered the Medes. So we also see in Isaiah 21 the burden against Arabia, which is, in the thickets of Arabia you must lodge, O caravans of Dadanites. So that means the caravans that used to come out of Dedan are going to have to hide away from their town and Arabia, which is, in that desolate area to the north. Bring water for the thirsty, O dwellers of Tema. Meet the refugees with food, for they flee from the sword is drawn, the bow is bent from the stress of battle. And this is a much more near term just for this particular group, because within 1 year, all of Kedar will be gone. And that is literally what happened when the Assyrians swept in. Go ahead.
And as we all know, Muhammad conquered Mecca within 1 year of Isaiah prophesying it. So clearly about him. While we're paused here, I'm going to take a super chat from Cheeky.
I can't answer this question in a 20-minute interview, nor is it wise to do so, which is why I never brought this topic up myself. You will not find one lecture of mine about this issue. It should never be brought up in public. And I don't like these idiots, and they are idiots, wallahi. This is not something you discuss amongst the masses, ya akhi. It's not wise. I encourage anybody who is really interested to go deep to take the class. I do this class. It'll be 1 year later.
So Cheeky Shiki says that he's learning a lot, and then Yasser Kadi says, I never talk about this, which is completely true. I mean, he would never talk about this. He's more famous for the holes in the narrative, of course, but in a previous interview, he said something along the lines of when he went to Yale secular university. They totally destroyed all of Islamic history and then just left him there. And that's the real reason he almost left Islam. But he decided, you know what? I believe the Quran. I don't care what history says. I can make up my own history and pretend it doesn't matter. Obviously, he didn't say
Nice.
those words, but
Yep. So yeah, that's just it is very special. It is really intensely special. So anyway, yeah, they don't want to talk about the actual locations that are in here because of course these are locations that are nowhere near Arabia at this time. Arabia does not extend linguistically, does not extend into the Hijaz. Like Arabia is not there. No one would call that Arabia for hundreds of years. It would take hundreds and hundreds of years before anyone would call places farther south Arabia. And I think it's probably the Romans who like spontaneously decided to assign Yemen the name of Arabia Felix, Happy Arabia. Like they just went, well, this area is Arabia, so we'll call all of that Arabia. Why not? Like it wasn't even called Arabia then.
So we do have a comment, possibly from an atheist, I don't know, from 1.4 gigahertz. He says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. I assume this stream means you've taken a critical look at Osiris, Inanna, Zamosis, Adonis, and Romulus. Well, 1.4 gigahertz, there's not really anything critical to look at because these theories are so ridiculous that scholars don't even raise them. Only complete morons on the internet raise these kinds of things. But I have, in fact, done multiple streams on this subject if you really want to check those out. But the gist of it is there is zero support for these theories, if you can even call them that. Literally no scholar, no accredited scholar in the world supports this nonsense.
No, it's beyond stupid. So anyway, the this is just a map of the uh, Neo-Babylonian Empire, which shows where the Arabs, the people inhabiting the place that was called Arabia then, were said to be, because that's where Arabia is. Arabia is up here in this area, and kind of slowly creeps down linguistically, but it's north. And here is Kedar with Duma, which was their center of essentially their capital. Duma, by the way, comes into history being ruled by a series of queens. We have not yet figured out what the language of Duma is, whether or not it was uh, within the linguistic grouping that could be called Arabic or not. Probably not, given what the other settled oases were for the most part. But they, for some reason, I think probably because there was some sort of vague memory of Kedar being important for a while, the Islamic scholars decided that they should trace Muhammad to Kedar. But that's a later invention. Early on, they had no consensus of even what son of Ishmael he was supposedly descended from. They just make up various things. So the first mention of Arabs or Arabia as in the later form, in the second late form of the word, occurred during the reign of Solomon in the form of a phrase about the kings of Arabia, right? And it's either the kings of the Arabs or the kings of Arabia. The word's the same in Hebrew, but it's usually translated as Arabia, and for a good reason, because it seems to be more territorial than anything else. And that's about 940 BC-ish. The first mention of a clear people group rather than like an area, a land area, is in the reign of Jehoshaphat, which is in around 860. And then for the Israelites and others, Arabia was not Yemen, but the scrubby wastes close to them. The Romans seem to have been the ones to really extend Arabia to the entire peninsula. So it's very important to note that Arabs did not at this point speak Arabic, so to speak. Like even what you would call, we had not yet reached the stage of Old Arabic yet. And most of the people who lived in the regions that would later be called Arabia would never speak Arabic in the pre-Islamic period because it was a minority language. So the first extra-biblical reference to Arab is on the Kerch monoliths, which are an Akkadian language record of the Assyrian conquest of Aram. And Aram was like northeast of Israel and north of Ammon. There's Ammon, Moab, Edom, Israel. It's off to the northeast. This is going to be reversed for all of you. So flip that around. Out up here, Israel here. Sorry, I have to do everything backwards. So the other later non-biblical attestations, in this whole BC time period, seem to be geographical first, and then from that applied to the people of that area. So by Thaban, or Thahban, son of Yamlek, son of whatever, anyway, son of Zaid, and he camped and took possession of the watering hole in the year thirst afflicted, or was upon Arb. It's how it's spelled, but Arab is how it's understood, right? The Arabs, and it seems to be talking about the people here. Because it's people really who thirst more than like a piece of land does, right? So it sometimes implies a lifestyle in some of the sources that seem to mention the Arabs, that it tends to be about these wandering groups. But the later you get, the less it seems to imply lifestyle, and the more it seems to imply people group, right? So,
Oh, hold on one second. I have to do this right away because Zayed Ali, he just came in. He left this comment. You're trying to provoke Muslim people in poor way somehow, but otherwise your provocation ways are old school because Muslims have high academic school for provocation teaching training center. Well, at least you said one thing right, that you guys are taught how to provoke, not how to be truthful. And then he immediately says goodbye, thank you. So he had no clue what the topic was. He just came in and left that comment about how we're trying to provoke Muslims when we're literally just talking about pre-Islamic history. If that provokes you, right? If that provokes you, then you got some serious problems. But in any case, thanks for admitting that you do go to Dawah school in order to learn how to provoke people, not to learn facts.
So one thing that I found quite interesting was the association between Arabs and prostitution. In Jeremiah 3:2, it says, "Lift up your eyes to the bare heights and see, where have you not been ravished?" Here it's blaming Israel for running after false gods. By the wayside you have been sat awaiting lovers like an Arab in the wilderness. You have polluted the land with your vile whoredom. So this is not attacking Arabs, it's just a statement. Like, you are like the Arabs who are known for sitting in the wilderness by the highway looking for lovers. And this is particularly interesting if you know about the women who went to Bosada, even in like the 19th and early 20th century. They're actually Berber descent, but they would go there to entertain and prostitute themselves to gain money, and then would go back to their home village and establish a house on all the money they'd made through prostitution. It was completely allowed in that part of the Islamic Empire and not controlled or looked down upon in any way, because that was just like their tradition, right? And they were Muslim too, by the way. So they were considered good Muslims as they were earning their like future wealth through prostitution for a period of 4 to 10 years, essentially, before they'd settle down and marry someone from their homeland. And then you also, very interestingly, have some wild stories from Herodotus about women having to in this region, like in the vague region of Mesopotamia. He has reports of women who have to like sleep with other men, and it's all this weird sexual stuff with the young women and all of this stuff. And
Weird sexual stuff of young women.
Oh, like before they can get married, they have to be like the Herodotus gets lots of really garbled stories, but usually there's something to the story somewhere. And so this seems to connect Arabs to a kind of ritual prostitution of their young women, and this would probably be because of religious purposes, most likely.
So control
So
yourself has a very difficult question that I can't answer. What doesn't provoke Muslims? And I can't think of anything, to be honest. I mean, we're just calmly talking about ordinary history here, and we've had several angry comments from Muslims. But if the chat knows something that doesn't provoke them, I would definitely want to hear that. So let me know if you see something that, or can think of something that doesn't provoke them. And from Luke, hi Thaddeus, I want to say God bless you, man. I look up to you and you're on fire for God. Well, thank you very much for that high compliment there. Reminder to everyone, you can highlight a comment by putting exclamation point highlight, and then I will be forced to read it. I mean, obviously, I'm not really forced to, but so thank you again for those kind words.
all right. So um so there's no evidence of a distinct linguistic shifts before the period of about, I don't know why I put to 500, but before the period of 1000 BC, there isn't really anything that any linguist thinks distinguish Arabic from all the ancient North Arabian dialects that are kind of related to Arabic from the central Semitic language grouping. By this time, Canaanite and all the associated languages like Hebrew had separated quite a bit from the central Semitic group. So there was this cluster over here that was kind of left behind. And it's really funny because Muslims take enormous stock in the fact that Arabic is a very conservative language as far as Semitic languages go, meaning it hasn't had as many changes from Proto-Semitic, even though it does not in any way resemble the Proto-Afroasiatic. It has not had as many shifts as most of the other languages have. But that is true almost always of the most backwater language or dialect of a group. For example, I'm sure no one in chat can guess this. What is the most conservative language of all the Indo-European languages, the language from which English comes? You guys know probably that Beowulf, like you can't understand Beowulf at all. Even Middle English, you would have to study for a while or live with people for a month to pick up Middle English because it's so different. And it wasn't all that long ago that we were speaking Middle English, right? English has changed a ton, but what's the most conservative? Well, the most conservative of all the Indo-European languages is Lithuanian. So all of you Lithuanian speakers out there, why would it be conservative? Because Lithuania was an area that was incredibly underdeveloped and backwater, historically speaking. Like the historic age did not reach Lithuania until remarkably recently. Yeah, it is Lithuanian is the most conservative. Everything else has had contact with other peoples and lots of changes happening, and it becomes cosmopolitan, and all the really difficult bits when lots of people have to learn your language, right? When lots of people have to learn your language, they don't want to learn all the bits that are hard. So it gets simpler because you have lots of people learning your language and speaking it differently, and you trying to teach people and trying to explain things, your language gets a lot simpler. Well, because Arabic was a backwater language, a lot, fewer of their more archaic and complicated aspects rubbed off and dropped. So it's just an aspect of really its isolation and backwardness, not of its sophistication and wonderfulness. But they're very, very proud of this.
I mean, that makes perfect sense. The more a language is spread, the more new people will come on contact with, the more chances for innovation
and simplification more than anything.
Yeah, Yep, that too. Jesus Bot says, Jesus is the only true God. Amen. Amen to that.
Amen.
And Ask Truth Apologetics answered me, and I think he has one. He says, what does not provoke Muslims is associating with Muhammad with Allah and their shahada.
Awesome.
Indeed, shirk, committing shirk when it's the shahada, perfectly good. Committing shirk in any other way, well, some may be good actually, because there are many other ways Muslims commit shirk. But in theory, it's supposed to be the unforgivable sin, yet it's something you have to do in order to enter into Islam. Very strange stuff.
So being an Arab is heavily linked in terms of the identity, is closely linked to camel riding, right? And that really developed around 1200 BC. There's no evidence of permanent settlements in the Central Hejaz during this time. And even after this, there's no evidence of anything south of, like north of the Yemen folks and south of Medina. There's not very many. There's like nothing there, guys. There really isn't. So these proto-Arab groups or the Midianites, those types of peoples, carried Proto-Sinaitic writing to South Arabia, meaning to Yemen. This is very important. So you guys know that the writing system that is used even for our alphabet originally came from, people say Phoenician, but really this proto or Sinaitic writing, which is itself from Egypt. So it was all taken from Egypt. Well, some people in this very early stage carried it to South Arabia as part of this culture of camel riding. And that's when we finally get writing in Yemen, and we finally get some inscriptions and can start putting together the history of Yemen, even though it had been settled for a long time there. It's pretty developed, just didn't have any writing. So it was all in prehistory. And it's after this point, finally we get history in Yemen because it gets carried down there. But interestingly, the people who carry it down there don't do very much writing themselves. They kind of teach them, but they don't have a huge amount of use for it, apparently. They may be linked to the Hyksos of Egypt in some way because of the timing of different things. So it's possible that the folks really came into the Hejaz and those areas and connected Yemen with the Levant through regular trade, at least, when the Hyksos came out of Egypt. Now, they may have been the ones who got pushed out by the Hyksos. Like, Hyksos are coming out, what are we going to do? And most people should know what the Hyksos are. They're the rulers of Egypt who were the Semites who ruled over Egypt for a time, and the Egyptians absolutely despised them and threw them out. And they were thrown out almost certainly quite a bit before the Israelites themselves left. It was the ruling class, and the people associated with them got thrown out. And they either most likely pushed out the folks who were already in that area, or else they themselves were the folks who ended up spreading out and trading a lot more because of being kicked out. It fits the linguistic data, it fits the writing data, it puts everything together in a nice little bow. But then those folks wouldn't be called Arabs, because the Arabs are still in the north. The Arabs are living in the area called Arabia, which is that little bitty piece of the north, right? But the associations of the folks living at the time of Muhammad with previous groups is based on the language and supposition. So they call themselves Arabs, and they speak the right language of the folks from that little area up there. This language is from the north, from that little area up there near Israel, like bordering on Israel, right? But language and identity doesn't mean that you're from that group biologically. Remember that Allah says that the only thing that matters is who your father actually is. And this group of people would be quite mixed mutts of all sorts of folks. And they wouldn't call themselves by their father's names because there was no tradition of that. You were called by the name of your association. There were tons of adoption, tons of association of that type, and it had nothing to do with your patrilineal line to these people until Muhammad came around and went, oh, all your traditions for all these years don't count. So the idea that they were Ishmaelites was an insult of the Jews. It wasn't from Muhammad, where Muhammad went, oh, we're from Ishmael. The Jews at the time called Christians Edomites. They called Christians Edomites because God said that, in the New Testament it says, Jacob I had loved, but Esau I have hated. The Edomites were placed below the status that the first son normally would be, which is called hate in the Bible. There's various places where this is called hate. And so the Jews were like, ha ha, Christians, you aren't from Jacob, you're from Esau, and so God really despises you because you're not one of us. Well, they're doing the same thing to the people of Muhammad. They're saying, you're not from Jacob, you're from Ishmael. And God said that you're a wild donkey and you are a plague upon everyone and you're violent and awful, so there. And Muhammad ran with that and invented this new prophecy, supposedly from Abraham, that said, aha, we will have a prophet from you, O Ishmael, kind of thing, right? He made this up. So this is something that is invented based on a particular insult of the Jews at the time. Is there a kind of kernel of truth to it? Sort of. The people who were Ishmaelites were among those who some of his descendants may have been given the label Arabs later. But there's no way to trace any particular person to the person of Ishmael. It's just impossible. And Muhammad had no such tracing. He couldn't say how he was descended from Ishmael. He just declared he was because the Jews said he was, right? But the Jews were not making the kinds of claims that the Muslims make. The Muslims are making the claims of bodily descent. And the Jews were saying, well, you're Arabs, and Arabs are associated with the group of Ishmaelites, and so therefore you have this clan identity, and that's all they're saying. So what is particularly revealing is that Muslim scholars often today, like you always hear, oh, he's from Kedar, he's from Kedar, he's from Kedar. But I've already talked about how Kedar is centered around Duma, which was urban and ruled by queens, which is a very different culture from the Quraysh, right? Ibn Ishaq preferred Nabat, which is traditionally linked to the Nabateans, who were at least nomadic for a lot longer and then later took over an area, right? Versus Kedar, which had been settled for a long time and might not have even spoken Proto-Arabic. We don't have enough analysis of their writing yet to be clear, but it's just not, it's completely missing the point that the Jews were making and the rhetorical battle that was going on between the Jews and Muhammad at the time. Now, what's really funny is you look at the descent in the Islamic sources. This puts Ishmael in that non-existent Mecca. Mecca did not exist at this time. It falsely makes he has one wife that makes Abraham mad, so he kicks that wife to the curb, and then he has a second wife that makes Abraham happy in the Islamic sources, and that wife that makes Abraham happy is from the Jurhum tribe, which is also supposed to be, which is literally non-existent at that time. But the Arabs say, no, the Jurhum tribe totally existed at that time, and he married this woman named Rala from this tribe who came from Joktan through Eber and Shem and Noah, right? But in other sources, the Jurhum are also supposed to be from these Qahtanite tribes, the sons of Qahtan. But for him to be, and then the Islamic sources say, oh, well, there were two. There was one early one, and then there was a second one. Well, the early one would have to be the one who's coming from Joktan, from Eber and Shem and Noah. That would have to be the early one. But then the sources say, oh, Ishmael married one from the second Jurhum. That's not possible. The second Jurhum has to be from Khatan. That has to be later, not from like a great grandchild of Noah. And so the Islamic sources are impossibly muddled on this point. And they're just trying very hard to make sense of it, because it was really embarrassing that Muhammad said that he married into this Jurhum tribe. Why? Because the Jurhum tribe is still supposed to be in charge of Mecca when the people shortly before the Quraysh come along.
Absolutely. So we have a comment here from Soyu, who used the highlight function to say Christians believe in the supernatural and Islam believes in the abnormal. I like that comment. Kind of similar, but completely different. And then we have a legitimate question from Angel here. So did any of these people in the Islamic sources actually exist?
Okay, so the Jurhum people were a real tribe. They were a real tribe in like the 4th or 5th or 6th century AD. So saying that this guy married into them 2,000 years before just makes no sense. No sense at all. So, and they realized that it makes no sense. And that's why they said, well, there was one Jurhum and then there was a second Jurhum. And then they say, well, he's from the second Jurhum. But then that doesn't make any sense, because the second Jurhum needs to be that second group that was in charge of Mecca. It's just like Jurhum exists and they're wrong for Ishmael to marry into. So, and it's important to know that they are Old South Arabian. They're from Yemen. They're South Semitic. They're not from the north. They're not Arabic or Arab peoples from that area of Arabia, which is to the north, right? They're from the south, and so they speak the southern language, which is totally different, very different. It's related to Ethiopic, like totally different language. But Ishmael is supposed to be the first prophet to speak Fusha Arabic. So he's supposed to speak clear Arabic. And it says, and he learned it from the Jurhum. It's from the Quran and Encyclopedia, but it's repeated everywhere. You go to any Islamic source, you'll find out who's the first person to speak Arabic. Well, it's Ishmael. And he's the first prophet to speak it, but people before him spoke it. The Jurhum spoke it. But the Jurhum would not have spoken any Arabic at all. They would have spoken South Arabian. It's totally the wrong language, completely messed up. Central Semitic at that time would have been barely differentiated into a few dialects, if any at all. Because remember, Hebrew comes from Central Semitic, Arabic comes from Central Semitic. If Abraham is the father of both, then these are the natural separation of the languages over time. And so his children would speak the exact same language. And if there were a few other people who spoke slightly different dialects, fine, but it makes no historical sense. It makes no geographical sense. It makes no linguistic sense. It's just gobbledygook. It's nonsense. Now, the language that was spoken in the area of the Hijaz as people occasionally wandered through it with their herds is unknown. It did become a dialect of Central Semitic after the expansion from the southern Levant in the 1200s BC, but nobody knows what it was before then, whether it was related to South Semitic or Central Semitic, or was, again, most likely a lost cousin branch of Semitic that's somewhere southerny, centrally, something like that, right? It was unknown, but it absolutely was not the ancestor of the Arabic that we have now. Like, it makes no sense whatsoever. It could be a different language in the Central Semitic family, but it could not be the ancestor of Arabic or a version of Arabic or anything like that. It just makes no sense. The descendants of Ishmael, according to the Islamic sources, would have lived near Mecca, speaking Arabic, which was somehow learned from people who speak a totally different language. Then they would have had to have migrated northward into Arabia proper, what was anciently Arabia, into that desert by 1000 BC. And then they would have gotten the name of Arab from that desert, and then they would have migrated southward again into the Hijaz. It's just nonsense. There's no reason for any of this. Nobody would come up with this if they were not forced to by Muhammad's crazy stories. And they're just trying to make it into something that makes some kind of sense. It just doesn't.
All right. Quick comment here. So RM has been distracting with his atheist nonsense. It's time to stop. Get on topic, please, or else I will have to put you in timeout. I entertained you for a while. I take responsibility of that. But you're not being productive. You're not helping any. You just keep asserting that there is no evidence. You reject all evidence given to you. It's just a waste of time. You're just playing a silly game while thinking yourself to be intellectually superior. So everyone in the chat, ignore him. If he continues to spam nonsense, I'll have to put him in timeout.
All right. So this is from the biography of the Prophet. You can find the same thing and a ton of different other Arabic sources, that the Arabs are divided into three groups: the super ancient folks, and then the Araba, who are supposed to be the true Arabs, and then the Mustaraba, who are supposed to be the Arabicized Arabs. And so they're supposed to be like adopt the culture or the being Arab from contact, right? We're going to skip the first group completely this time and just talk about the second two. According to the Islamic sources, these true Arabs are the Qatanites, the Yemeni people, the people from South Arabia. They're supposed to be the true Arabs, even though, remember, that the place called Arab or Araba, actually with that name, is to the north. And the language developed in the north, and it's related to the languages of the north. No, somehow these people way in the south are the true Arabs and actually spoke that language through I don't know what first and taught other people. And then they became Arabicized. So these these are the North Arabs who somehow became Arabicized, learning language from people who didn't speak it. It's just nonsense. And it's like even hard to listen to because it absolutely makes no sense. So
I'm going to pause you right there. That was a perfect time to pause you. He said this a little bit earlier, but you just said makes no sense, right? Watt has been waiting for an hour to find something that he could dispute with you. And he says, makes no sense in Sister Mary's eyes. We know she is greatest scholar in her time. So making fun of you saying that it makes no sense somehow means that it does make sense, apparently. He did have one other comment. He said, Hungarians and Turks came from same race, yet their Turkic languages are different. What's your point?
So stupid.
That has nothing to do with anything you said.
Stupid. So this is like saying that I went and lived with the Hungarians and they talked me true Turkish and they are the true Turks. That is what's the equivalent of saying. I went and met the Hungarians and I lived with them, and from them I learned the language of the true Turks, aka, Turkish and Turkey, right? I don't mean like a Turkic language, right? I mean Turkish, what we call Turkish. I learned from them Turkish. It makes no sense. That is literally what it's saying. I went to the French, and from them I learned the language Spanish because they are the true Spaniards. Like, that is the level of argument here. Like, I know that this is super confusing because it really is. That's what they're saying. I went to the French, and from them I learned Spanish, and they're the true Spaniards. But Spanish and French are both Latinate languages, so that totally could have happened. No one would say this would happen because it's just word salad. It's nonsense. So there are a few kernels of truth about the relationship between Yemen and northern Arabs. Remember, they're trading back and forth, and they have traded, and as they trade, they also pick up a lot of the culture, and they pick up certain aspects of the culture. But that doesn't mean that they come from them, and it doesn't mean that their language is from them. Their language is from the north. Their language is only from the north, guys. So the Arabs of the Arabah adopted stone monuments like people from farther south had, and that migrated from the southward toward the northward. Not a huge amount southward, but from the southward area, right? So we also find that the Arabs were influenced by South Arabian paganism, which is more like the Akkadian paganism of the Bronze Age, or generally Bronze Age Semitic paganism in general. And so they had an emphasis on moon gods that you don't find in the Northwest at that time, and the crescent moon and that sorts of things. But they also had and adopted and worshipped many distinctively Northwestern gods too. For example, Alat definitely got her name from the north. Dromedaries, that means one-hump camels, were probably originally domesticated on the southeast coast of Arabia, so in Yemen. So if you say that being Arab means camel culture, the first Arabs would have been South Arabians in. But if Arab means the Arabic language and the complete pre-Islamic cultural package, then no, not at all. Or even genetic descent. They're from up there. They're not from down there. Not wives, not anything, right? Some of them migrated down there and influenced them in that way, but the reverse migration didn't happen nearly as much. Happened some, but not as much. So yes, Yemen was originally Saba or Sheba, but that doesn't have to do with anything. It's still the speakers of the South Arabian languages. So the influence of the north on the south. The South Arabian languages were influenced by contact with the Central Semitic languages so much that it actually confuses the apparent relation of the Ethiopic languages to the entire family tree. This influence had to happen after Ethiopia was colonized, which the earliest that you can push it to is like the really late 11th century BC. But that's about the earliest that you can push it to. So that means that the influence was over years and years and years after that point that you get to see more features of Central Semitic in the South Semitic language. But the Islamic narrative most likely represents elements of Islamic myth-making plus really vague memories of the origins of camels, and that's how you get to all of this. But notice, if Muhammad's people are from South Arabia, they are not Ishmaelite. Here is where the people of Ishmael and all the people of that cultural milieu are from, right? Up here. It's Selah, Duma, Tata, Tema, Dedan, Kedar, up here. Not way the heck down here. These are very distant places, much less way down there. So it's just a kind of muddled type of story.
So before you go on, let me take this super chat from Control Yourself.
Right.
And Allah will bless you in a million ways. You find the tree will grow and you will have lots and lots of wealth. This is the example that we gave to the children. And I'm letting you know that when you sow that seed by giving, you shall receive much more than you gave by the will of Allah. Give as much as you can, for indeed you will reap much more than you have sown.
A very appropriate one there, considering the content of the super chat that says awesome stream and information yet again, you two. To the chat, remember to support your favorite channels every now and then, and just to say thanks and show you appreciate all the background work that happens. And when you do show your support by sowing that seed of donation, you will grow a very big tree. Now, you won't get very wealthy, unlike what the Mufti or Gufti Menk promises, but you will definitely provide benefit because it helps spread the teaching to people and such. Money religion, which gives money. Snake oil selling Muslims. The whole apple. I always appreciate your comments on the silly little clips, but it's not a silly clip to Mufti Mank. I mean, he's 100% serious. He really wants you to donate to his ministry, and supposedly you'll get rewarded for that. He's not joking around. I am, but he is completely serious in his claim there. And a highlighted comment from Suyub. Mary, you reading only his story. How about a little bit of her story also? Silly comment. It's just a silly comment, but
Yes.
you used the highlights. So I'm now obligated to
So
to read
there
it.
we go. I got it. But yeah, Jawad here is still trying to make the point that he thinks that Spanish can be learned from the French. Those languages had differentiated. Okay? They had differentiated into totally different languages at this point. Just because they're from an original same language, Latin is the parent language of both French and Spanish. If you arrive in France at a time that French and Spanish had developed as separate languages, they're not vulgar Latin is not spoken. But French and Spanish are, and you cannot go to the French and say that you have now learned Spanish. They have developed into completely separate languages. The old South Arabian language. No, they are not different versions of the Arabic language.
So
again,
Wad thinks
we
that
will go
Spanish and French are different versions of the Latin language.
No, sweetheart. And the language is not Arabic. Arabic is not the Proto-Semitic language. It's not. It is not mutually intelligible. The rule as to whether or not a language is the same language as something else is whether or not it's mutually intelligible. That's like saying that English and Russian are the same language because they're different versions of English. I'm going to call it all English because English comes from Indo-European, but it comes from it through the most direct and pure and wonderful lines. So therefore, it's all English, and Indo-European is English, and
Mm-hmm.
and High German is English, and Gothic is English, and Old English is English, and Middle English is English, and this is English, and it's all true English, and Russian is just a different version of English.
So I don't know if he's making fun of himself or he's being serious, but he said the French and Spanish being different languages is just a theory.
That sounds about his.
I think he's probably making fun
making
of,
fun of it
or poking fun of it
yeah.
himself. So I appreciate that.
Jawad,
And
the
Watt says, I'm talking about the root. Well, the root of Spanish and French is Latin.
Doesn't matter.
You're such an idiot.
The root of Spanish and the root of French is Latin. They are not Latin. They are different languages. So if you go to France and you speak French fluently, you have not learned Spanish just because they have the same root. At the time of Abraham, South Semitic was a totally different language that had been isolated for well over 1,000 years. Okay? It had been isolated since about 3200 BC. It represents a strain of Semitic that came from the western branch about 3200 BC-ish, maybe a bit before. Okay? So and this is like 1700 BC, way more than 1,000 years apart. Mm-hmm. It's a different language than the Central Semitic speakers came and are speaking. It's a different he's coming speaking Central Semitic. And it's worse. It's worse than what he's saying. Because basically it's saying that someone who speaks medieval Spanish went to the medieval French and learned modern Spanish because he was already speaking the ancestor of that very language. Like it's just nonsense. Abraham already spoke the ancestor of the languages that would become Arabic and Hebrew and all the rest of that. He probably spoke that language was probably united at that time. And so that language has already been being spoken by those people. Then there are these people out here who speak a different diet or a different language that has been isolated and changed over more than 1,000 years. And you're saying that this guy went from here over here and learned the descendant of this language here. Got it?
No, Wad doesn't get it, but we're going to move on. But I do have a couple comments that I want to read real quick here on before they are no longer relevant. Cecil says, he, meaning Goofy Mink, sounds like Kenneth Copeland, doesn't he? Indeed he does. Indeed he does. And then Furin Kazan says, if Christianity has the prosperity gospel, does that mean Islam has the prosperity hadith? Yeah, we could go with that. I like that you used hadith instead of Quran, since Islam is mostly about the hadith. Good call there.
Giving a loan to Allah is definitely Quran and not hadith, right?
That's true. That's true. But we're just talking about the term for it. It's not like people preaching the prosperity gospel are really reading the Bible. So,
yeah.
And finally, from Beb, I am French. Don't ask me to teach you Spanish, please. Just to get Mary's attention. Love your work. God bless you both. Thank you very much for the encouragement, and thank you for using the highlight function.
Now we're going to go on to Achaemenid Persian Empire, and this is a fairly short bit because it's one big, really important empire, but then it gets wiped out by our buddy Alexander the Great, Mr. Dhul-Qarnayn, right? So our two-horned one, the Prophet of Islam, will wipe out the Achaemenid Empire. So if this is a timeline of Israel, we have Assyria, Babylon, and then Persia takes over, as we had already talked about. And the North and South kingdoms existed till they get wiped out. The North one gets wiped out by Assyria. Babylon takes Judah into exile. And then when Persia comes along, Persia says, oh, you can go back home. So we need to know about who the Indo-Europeans in the East were. We kind of talked a little bit about the Hittites, who are an Indo-European people, and the Mitanni, who are an Indo-European people. But these are the Indo-Iranian group of the Indo-Europeans, who they're mounted horse archers, barbarian types, right? So they gradually displaced the Elamites who were already over there, though the Elamite language continues as a minority until after the Arab conquest, which is pretty amazing that survived that long. And someone asked me last time about the Tarim Rim mummies, and I looked up the source I had read. It's actually from 2021 on the genomic origins of the Bronze Age Tarim Rim Basin mummies by Fan Jiang. And if it is correct, because sometimes Chinese studies are a little bit off, but it seems, just looking at the genetic data, it seems to be legit. They seem to be more related to the Botai folks, if you know who they are. They are an Eastern hunter-gatherer, an ancient North Eurasian group without the Caucasian admixture that makes Indo-Europeans distinct. So they're kind of a cousin group. And they have some more West Siberian hunter-gatherer in the mix. And they also tamed horses, but none of the modern horses are descended from them. And they also may have invented the pants. So the Tarim Rim folks are maybe related to the pant inventors, but they are not themselves Indo-European.
So I have to stop you for a second here. I don't know, you probably haven't seen it, but a long time ago there was a meme on the internet of a fortune cookie that for some reason said, "Pants is key to happiness." So we now know that this people group is responsible for human happiness because they gave us pants.
Yeah, that's very cool. Well, and they gave us pants because people who ride horses like pants instead of just a loincloth and leggings that leaves the
Well,
skin
yeah,
gets
I
bare.
would say that
Yeah,
for them, that
pants
definitely
for
is the key to
happiness. There we
happiness because
go.
otherwise they're going to be chafed in a bad area.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, the Indo-Europeans, we're going to talk a bit about their religion later on. So I do want to cover a little bit of back work about the Indo-Europeans. Um, so Media was the first great power that was in this area out of these Eastern Indo-Europeans. Of course, the Hittite Empire was a great empire in the West over here in Anatolia and the thumb of the Middle East. Uh, there were also Lydians who were Indo-European speakers who were cousins of those Hittites, and they invented coins. If you've heard the word riches Croesus, that is from the king of Lydia who invented like stamping coins and with little images and stuff. So thanks to him, we have little images with writing on it that really help us figure out who folks are. So the Chaldean folks on this map here, it says Chaldean Empire. They just mean the Neo-Babylonian. That's an old name for them here. So that's who these folks are. Here's the Lydians who took over Phrygia too, and Media, or the Medes, as they're often called, who took over this huge area. Notice Bactria, Parthia, Persis, that will be our Persia. These are different areas inside of the Median Empire, and they were mostly ruled by these same kind of violent nomadic types who are now settling down but hadn't yet learned how to write. This writing thing is hard for them. Be kind. So the local ruler of this area, Persis here, he was the ruler down here. He overthrew the Median rulers, the dynasty, and basically took over the whole area. And his name was Cyrus the Great, as you may have heard of him. Very, very famous, right? So, and he had controlled the area of the Medes, but he invaded Mesopotamia and he came up with a casus belli, a cause of war. He said, I am the good guy because Nabonidus, you want to make sin the god and not Marduk. And so I am restoring all good things. I'm helping everybody out. I'm going to let people honor the gods that they choose. Look how great and generous and good and kind and wonderful I am. Now, if you've seen the movie 300, you will now understand why Iranians were so angry at that movie, because the Persians' big thing was like, we let everyone be themselves. All they have to do is like obey us as a small part of the empire. They were first multicultural empire, embracing all different peoples and creeds and religions and everything else, and generous and kind as long as you let them rule. And if you didn't, then they take over. And on the other hand, Sparta's like this absolute hellscape for anyone who isn't a citizen, where they just slaughter the helots as part of their training and oppress people. And they're like, we believe in freedom and wonderfulness and democracy, and those Persians are despots. It's just, it's hilarious that was how 300 ended up being portrayed and why Iranians are so angry about it. So these guys seemed absolutely unstoppable. They rolled across the land. They took back Egypt. They went all the way across Lydia and all of those places that had been independent for quite a long time, and jumped the Hellespont, took over the Greek city-states along the coast, and they're like, hey, Greece mainland, you need to obey us. Well, Greek mainland said, no, thank you. And that's where you get Thermopylae and all of those sorts of stories, and the Battle of Marathon and all of those kinds of things. Salamis, the naval battle, all those famous things. The Greco-Persian Wars, where the Greeks, who were the underdogs, managed to stop the Persians flat. And that just kind of halted their expansion for a while. But everybody knew that that something was going to happen. Something had to give. You can't just sit there defying an empire forever. The empire is going to take you out if it can. But the Jews managed to return in 638 BC because of Cyrus the Great saying, hey, Jews, you can go back and you can build your temple, and I'll even give you help and money, and I'm going to be wonderful to all of you. Just listen to me. So Zoroastrianism was not the religion of Cyrus the First. It's very important and interesting. It was made the state religion by Darius the First. Darius claimed to be that's supposed to say was not. Sorry, that's a typo. Darius was not a closely related to Cyrus the First. He claimed to be a distant relation, like, oh yeah, my great-great-grandfather was Cyrus the Great's great-great-great-grandfather, or something like that. Most people think that it was just he was overthrowing a previous usurper who had usurped the throne, and he was saying, my claim's more valid than his. He's a clear usurper, but I'm totally legit. But there's a very good chance that he was in no way related to Cyrus the First. But when he came in, he established Zoroastrianism as a state religion. Now, Cyrus the First is important because he established Aramaic as the state religion for writing. And that was important because cuneiform had previously been used, was really hard to read. Look at this nonsense. You would have to memorize hundreds of individual cuneiform words for individual meanings. And they did develop a syllabary over time. So like K plus A, so Ka is this one, is in this row, and Ga is below it, and Ka is below that, and Pa is below that, and Ba is here. And so they did have a syllabary for filling in with words, but they didn't use it just to build words. You also had to memorize all of these actual words. And plus, that's a lot of strokes to make just one syllable. Like, imagine how long that would take. So Aramaic, Aramaic was being written with this nice abjad, which is like a consonantal alphabet, like so much easier to learn, so much easier to read. So these illiterates came in, took one look at this cuneiform, which had been used since the time of the Sumerians, said, no, thank you. What else have you guys got? Oh, almost everybody speaks Aramaic because of this massive invasion of these Aramaeans. And you have this language that can be written really easily. Let's go with that instead. And so that is basically this whole family, because it's just so superior. And remember, we talked about the Proto-Sinaitic before, coming from Egyptian hieroglyphs, so superior to everything else that basically the vast majority of alphabetic type systems are related to that and descended from that. And so this is not even complete. The one on the right is not complete, but together they kind of give you an idea of what it looked like locally at this time. So at this time, Aramaic existed. Old Hebrew was different and separate. It was descended more directly from the Proto-Sinaitic, and that should not be Phoenician syllabary, it should be Proto-Sinaitic. But the Old Hebrew is related.
We caught your error, Mary. You're discredited.
I didn't make that error. I did not make that error, but I was not going to draw out an entire thing myself. I was just going to explain where they got it wrong. Where I didn't have the not. That is kind of would really throw you off because I'm saying contradictory things with that error. But Hangul, like that's a Korean system. It's descended from the Egyptian hieroglyphs through this system. Crazy. Nabatean does not exist yet. Arabic doesn't exist yet. But Aramaic exists, and then eventually, so while they're in exile, Ezra had the Torah and all the books, all the holy books of the Jews written using this new alphabet, because the Aramaic alphabet was still better than the old Hebrew alphabet, and everybody there, because they were the elites, they were being trained at the time, they were being served, so they were being taught how to read in Aramaic. And so switching out the letters to a different letter form just made things easier. And so Ezra made that change. It's recorded in the Talmud. The Samaritans, who were left behind in Israel, remember, they never made this change. So theirs is still on an alphabet based on this old Hebrew system. But all that's changed is the alphabet. The words haven't changed. So and it's also important to note that this Zoroastrianism, their holy language is Avestan, right? And this Pahlavi alphabet was later developed around 300 BC to first write the Persian language, because they're like, hey, we're Persians. Why are we writing literally everything in Aramaic all the time? Why can't we have our own system? So around 250 BC, this system of letters was developed. Then, only around the AD 200s to 300s, a sacred script was developed specifically for recording official versions of the Gathas of Zoroaster. That means the religious poems upon which the entire religion was based. It had never been written. It was entirely oral, because Avestan is the language of Zoroastrianism that these Gathas were written in. So the Gathas were memorized in. So they had maintained their sacred scripture as something entirely oral, never written, because for them, the sacredness was in the memorization and in the chanting and in the intonation, and the act of memorization was super important to the religion. This is identical to how the Vedas were treated. The Vedas were not written down until long after a writing system had entered and had been circulating for a while, and then they were finally written down. This means that we don't actually know fully what the Gathas looked like at the time of Darius the First. So you can't make too many positive statements about them because they weren't written down. They weren't a dead language. Like, the language that by the time it was written was totally dead. So we do know it's old, but that doesn't mean that there couldn't have been some meddling in the interim, because it wasn't written. We have no evidence that it was perfectly preserved and all of that. But it's very interesting how the ideas about how Islam should be, or how the Quran ought to be treated, how similar it is to the Gathas and the Vedas, not to how Jews and Christians dealt with their scripture, but the poetry, the rhyming, the chanting, and the importance in that, and the memorization, and how memorization was more important than comprehension. This is not from the religion of Abraham. It's over these kind of Eastern ideas got into it. Now, because the Bible was whenever it was copied into a new script with different letters. Some really dumb people in the 19th century decided that the Torah must have been written
earlier than that. It would be the
right?
17th or 18th. Yeah, I think it's the 17th already, but
yeah,
it was the 18th century at the latest. Anyway.
Okay, but anyway, they came up with this idea. Oh, well, if it's written in these letter forms, then it must be from the time period that those letter forms are from. And that makes no sense, because, of course, we have majuscules and minuscules and all these different letter forms that we have for the Bible in Greek and the Bible in Latin. They're written in different letter forms, and yet the idea that people would change letter forms because a different letter form's easier to read and easier to write, just beyond these people. So they went, oh, it's in these letter forms, so it must have been written then, right? Totally must have been written then, and must have been compiled by tons of different documents and edited and put together into this brand new thing that had never existed. Now, the reason that Ezra and the rest of the folks were supposed to have done that is because they wanted to forge an identity for their people. Now imagine that you want to keep your people group together as you're in exile. Would you do that by switching out your religion for something entirely different that you've never done before in order to maintain your cultural identity? How many people do you think would be like, yeah, I'll sign up for that. Let's change our religion. Now that we're out here, to maintain our identity, we're going to totally change our religion. So no one had to go along with any of this because Ezra had no actual authority in Babylon, right? And yet many people supposedly just went along with it. And this was supposed to allow the Jews to suddenly have a unique resilience after returning to Levant. Like before they didn't, but now they have an identity because they made up and switched out their religion entirely. So now they have an identity. Makes no sense. This is supposed to explain the alphabet, explain monotheism, and explain text chunking that is either real or completely imagined. But linear chronology, that events in the past happen before events in the future, destroy this dumb hypothesis. So the Samaritans existed as Yahweh worshiping groups upon the return of the exiles. They were the descendants of those who worshipped Yahweh on the heights and rejected the legitimacy of the kings. A lot of them did lots of bad things. They claimed that God had a wife, and they ran after Baals and stuff like that. But they did worship Yahweh, and they did keep their own copy of the Torah, and it was written in that old or Paleo-Hebrew script. They never changed their script. It developed slightly in form over time, just through natural processes, but they didn't change it out for the Aramaic script, so they already had that. And the Talmud agrees it. Ezra changed the writing system for the Hebrew Bible. They changed the letter forms, and the Samaritans kept their letter forms. But if this dumb hypothesis were correct, then what happened was the opponents of Ezra, the Samaritans, decided to adopt the parts of the holy text that his forged, made up a religion said that they believed in, that he had made up in exile, in order to fulfill the role of bad guy that he had already created for them, and in this entirely new text. And they also changed the writing system back to Paleo Hebrew to like really add to the evidence that what he said was true. It just makes absolutely no sense.
Well, I have a refutation for you. It's on the Bible's website that this is what happened.
It's on their website. Don't go like this. It's on their website.
See, it's on the Bible's website. You got to just go to biblewebsite.com, and then you'll see the official teaching of the Bible is that the documentary hypothesis is true.
Yeah, I'm sure it's in the Vatican somewhere. The Pope is hiding it, because that's what all the Muslims say. The Pope's hiding it. It's in the Vatican library. I swear.
Yeah, he has the real Injil. That's why no one knows about it. Every priest knows about this, but none has ever talked about it because the Pope has it.
Yep. So there is kind of a question about what language was the Torah itself composed in, right? And we call it Hebrew, but before the exile, the Israelites, Phoenicians, Canaanite, Ugaritic people, they all spoke mutually intelligible dialects of the same language. So you can say that it's the Hebrew dialect of this overall Northwestern Semitic language, which people like to call Canaanite because the language, the land, the area is called Canaan. It's not called the Levant or anything at that time. It's called Canaan. So they like to call it the Canaanite language. So it is interesting that the biblical poetry has more archaic features, which have more parallels with the Canaanite glosses of the Marna letters, which are even older. And they have more common, not borrowed Akkadian features with those. And this is typical of language of poetry. Language of poetry is usually more old-fashioned. And so this would add to the authenticity of the text is coming from that period, to have a register that's older for poetry. It's just what people do in almost every culture. You can find it over and over again. It's really kind of wild how predictable this is. So most of the changes between the language of the time of Moses and the pre-diacritical text in the Masoretic forms, most of them would have been, in terms of reading, they would have been grammatical vowel forms that would not be easily captured in the text. They're just not written there. So it's hard to say whenever a lot of changes took place in terms of how people pronounce it, because a lot of that isn't reflected in the text, and that's a problem with analyzing all of the Semitic languages before people invented ways of showing vowels, right? So the vowel lengthening that took place after the 13th century is generally shown in the Aramaic skeletal text, but that aids in the pronunciation of the pre-exilic courtly dialect. So it's a feature of this Aramaic skeletal text that helps you say it better in the way that people would have been saying it at the time of the exile. It's a little bit of an obscure point. But something that's important is that ancient North Arabian at this time, at the time of like the say the time of the kings, this courtly text, the courtly dialect time, it was not mutually intelligible with the language of the Torah. So the Torah and ancient North Arabian, the Arabic that's separated out, they are really different languages by this point. And that is it.
Oh, very good.
That's for
because we got some new information from the chat here. It turns out that Jesus put it on the Bible website 300 years before the internet was invented.
That sounds like the kind of timelines that a lot of, see, that's why I stress like things occurring in geography and in time, and place and time. Things occur in a place, things occur in a time, and they can't occur in a place they didn't occur in or in a time they didn't occur in. You can't flip around time. The afters can't happen before the befores. You can't do that. It makes no sense. And people keep mucking with things with their weird theories that just make no sense.
There is some debate, though. Beb says, I think it was actually Paul who created the website, not Jesus. So we'll just have to leave that as a mystery.
Sounds likely.
Do you have some other comments? First, super chat from Informed Infidel.
If you frequently say it, Allah would pay off your debts. So you can refer to it back again, inshallah.
So the Informed Infidel says, ask your school about earning college credits listening to Mary. I agree. That was at least 2, probably 3 college level lectures in one.
And yeah, this one's heavy lifting, guys. There's gonna be like a little bit more heavy lifting, and after that it's all downhill and super easy compared to that. But it's just like things happen in places and times, and then they tell these weird stories that can't work and don't happen in places and times. It's just goofy. So
I will go ahead and open up the chat. I do have some things to do today, but if Muslims call in, I would be happy to welcome them. If others call in, I'll ask them to keep it brief because, like I said, I have other things I need to get done today. But in the meantime, while we wait to see if anyone will call in, I do have, well, first of all, this comment, this highlighted comment here. RM's logic, hey, I disproved the existence of barium. How, you ask? Simple, by throwing out all the samples of barium. And that's pretty much exactly how it goes. Anything that you supply as evidence doesn't count as evidence. Therefore, there is no evidence. Therefore, theists are stupid for believing in God. That's pretty much how the argument goes every single time I talk with an atheist. Control yourself. So I have some legitimate questions, but first a couple humorous comments. Control Yourself says, anyone else think Mufti Mink idolizes his beard? Which was then followed up by Sunny saying, if you have the perfect beard, it's practically a PhD in Islam.
it really is. People ask folks who have good beards, like, why aren't you a Muslim? You have a beard, you should be Muslim because you have, what kind of religion is this? Like, do you bow to pray? You're basically a Muslim. Do you have a beard? Beards are basically Muslim. All these poor East Asian people must be terrible Muslims automatically because they can't grow very good beards.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, it's happened numerous times where someone who speaks against Islam all the time for whatever personal reason decides to grow a beard, and then suddenly all the Muslims are like, you see, he's almost converted. He's practically there. He grew a beard. And I would say they're they're being silly and they're having fun, except they're 100% serious usually when they say
Yes,
stuff
they
like that.
are. And I just want everyone to pause and think about the mindset of people who think that changing your hairstyle is practically converting to your religion, even though your hairstyle is in no way distinctive of your religion, right? Tons of people have beards, but basically a Muslim. Clay's comment about beards. Man, dude, the huge beards are a sign for knowledge, and those Duck Dynasty guys are high up there to Muslim. I heard that the whatever it was who did their reality show like asked them all to grow beards, so they like almost became Muslim for the show. Even better.
Yeah. And Soyub says monkeys are Abduls too. I guess because they're covered in fur, right? But they don't really have a distinct beard, so maybe not. I don't know. We'll see. All right, so some real questions that weren't
Oh
on
no, he's
topic.
remember that there are Muslim monkeys because they
Oh,
were
well,
stoned
yeah,
a
he could
lot.
be referring to that
So
too. I'm
they
not
were
sure
they're
which.
good Muslim monkeys because they stone other monkeys for fornication. Really,
Hmm.
guys, really saw it, guys. And so even though they don't have beards, they can be good Muslims. Billy
Yeah,
goats
well,
are Muslim.
I was just assuming it was related to the beard tuck since of when it was made, but he could have been referring to that hadith. Anyway, I have some questions I did want to answer that weren't directly on topic, so I left them to the end. Oh, one more funny comment that I wanted to read. I hear that the publisher of the Curion is Crayola. Is that true, or is it just a colorful tale? Like with the puns over and over again. Too funny. All right. So Yeshua's disciple said, the other day I met a Muslim who claimed that Jesus may have called the Father Allah in the Aramaic language. I don't think it's true, but how can I prove that it's not true in order to debunk? Well, I mean, you can't prove Jesus didn't say a word,
Well, you
but
can
it's there
prove
is,
that it's not Aramaic. It's not Aramaic.
yeah,
Al,
well,
yeah.
I mean, in principle, like he could have made those sounds, right? You can't prove he didn't make some sounds, uh, but there's no evidence for it, and it's the Muslim who wants to make the claims responsibility to give evidence.
Well, he's
Mary,
claiming.
Yeah, Mary can explain the argument they're trying to make, but I would say you're better off at least first demanding the Muslim give you some evidence, because in all likelihood they have no clue what they're even saying.
Yeah,
But
they'll
go ahead
probably
and
say that
explain.
Allah is an Aram is means God in Aramaic, but it doesn't. Al Ilah means the God in Arabic. Allah is not the same sounds as Al Ilah, the God. And Ilah has the same distant Semitic root as Aramaic words for God. But Allah, which is the Arabic al, the definitive article, which does not exist in Aramaic, you drop out the I, which is actually the funny thing is, so it is believed that El was originally the word for God generic, just entirely generic. And then just through phonetic expansion, it became Eloh. So Eloh is actually an expansion of El, which is the particle that actually means God. It's not the Oh part. And Il is another form of that particular word. For example, in the South Arabian languages, it's Il. And it's Ilah, Ilah in Arabic. But then if you drop out the part, then you actually are dropping out the part that's the particle that had the meaning in the first place, and you're just leaving the expansion bit. So you're leaving like the extra piece and not the part that originally had the meaning of God. You're left with essentially what would be in isolation a nonsense syllable if it weren't now associated with the idea of God so firmly. So that's where it gets particularly funny, is that they drop out the part that is actually the meaningful piece of the syllable, like the part that has a meaning, and they throw that away and they leave the sound behind together with the. So if you're going to play the etymological fallacy, ask them what happened to the il. Like the il, which is the phonetic equivalent of el, of which Eloh is just the expansion, right?
Yeah, and since Allah is not a personal name, at least according to
Yeah.
what most Muslims will say, even though they insist on calling him Allah when they're not speaking Arabic, thus making it into a personal name. But even if it's not, if it's not the personal name for God, it's just a generic term meaning God, then why in the world would it be meaningful that another language also uses the word God? Are you saying everyone who says God is talking about the same thing? Of course not. So it's just
Yeah.
completely silly
Well,
from any angle you come
well,
at it.
what's even funnier is, well, so, and it sounds sort of, and as I was talking about the Hebrew Eloh, but you go to Aramaic and it is Elaha, but that L part, that L is the part that means God. It's not al the, it's not El means the, right? The El is the part that means God, but in Allah, that al part just means the. Like it just gets crammed together and treated as a name because you say Bismillah in the name of Allah, it is his proper name. But where's the L part? In Aramaic, El, right there, not the. So it's just very silly.
Yeah, exactly. El in some languages means the, but not in Hebrew or Aramaic. So it has nothing other than superficial resemblance to Allah. But even if it was, shared a same root from a language that connects them, it would still be meaningless. So it's just such a stupid thing to say
Yeah,
from the very beginning.
it's like Mormons saying, "Oh, we worship the same God." We are polytheists and we believe that there are millions of gods, but we totally worship the same God. No, you don't. You give them the same names, but you worship an entirely different concept of who God is. And anyone can use the word, any particular word, to mean anything that they like. But if the identities don't match, then it's not the same being.
Absolutely. So another good question here from John Newton. Were the Philistines part of the Sea Peoples?
Yes and well, yes and no. So if you look in the Bible, and the Talmud actually records this incredibly well, it's astonishing the oral history that they managed to record there. The Talmud says, hey, there are two groups of people called the Philistines. So what the Bible records is the name of the people who lived in that place at the time of Moses. And at that time, their name is Philistines. And Philistine is a name from the Sea People that was adopted when the Sea People invaded, took over the Semitic peoples that were there. They formed a very thin layer of nobles on top of them. But they totally assimilated into the culture that was there before. They all have Semitic names, they have Semitic traditions, like the evidences of Greek pottery come and then just kind of disappear almost immediately. So Abimelech, it was the title for the king. It means father of the king, right? And so they were called Abimelech before the Sea People invaded, and they're called Abimelech after the Sea People invaded. So yes, they are part of the Sea Peoples. You find the Greek genetics, which get diluted pretty quickly, but they existed as a polity before the invasion as well, and they're still called Philistines then because it's written in the time of Moses, so it will have clarity to the people of the time of Moses as to who they're talking about.
Yeah, definitely an interesting topic there. Maybe we'll do a show on that someday. Wouldn't be, polemical or even apologetic. It would just be purely interesting. A couple comments related to the previous one here on the phonic fallacy. Allah and Dracula sound the same and both need blood sacrifice. Are they the same?
I like
And
it.
Control Yourself says, guys, please don't be too harsh on Allah for his Arabic. I mean, Arabic is a really difficult language to learn, okay? And then finally, from Trinity Matrix, Allah confused Mecca with Rebecca because, again, they sound the same.
Awesome.
Another question here from Control Yourself. Where are the knowledgeable Muslims? All we see from them is response that either totally avoid the question or insults or diversions back to the Bible. So, there was some chat about this being oxymoron, or there aren't any informed Muslims. I would say there are knowledgeable Muslims, but they're so overwhelmed because it's so difficult to be knowledgeable in Islam and somehow suppress your ability to realize that it's false. And you have to learn everything, or else you're in big trouble, because if you only know half of it, you might accidentally end up questioning Islam, which will take you out of the fold automatically. So there are knowledgeable Muslims, but they are so overwhelmed, they no longer make any attempt of talking to people outside of the people they're training to hopefully be able to escape the arguments that make Islam false. So that would be my answer, that they're in their mosques afraid to talk to the public. So Una says Quran 4:14 seems to suggest Arabic was chosen to be understood by the prophet. Why not pick the prophet who spoke a more widely understood language?
That has to do with what Muhammad's theology was at the time he was an early prophet. His early theology is, hey, we are the most backwater place in the world. And so we are the last people to receive the prophet that's been promised. Everywhere else has got every other town. This is an important point. Every town in the world has already gotten a prophet. And now we are the last one to get it. And now, because now that the last prophet has come to the last people, I am the prophet of this people, then the end of the world is going to come imminently, any moment now. It's the end of the world because the last prophet has come from the most insignificant place, and that's going to be the end. So,
yeah, quite a few comments along these lines. Knowledgeable Muslims equal ex-Muslim, and educated Muslim is an apostate, but informed infidel gets it better. One can't believe in Islam and be honest and intelligent. And actually, I would disagree with that as well. It's at least closer. But here's the thing. If you really understand Islam and you're really well educated and you really know what Islam's about, you know that it is about control, about power, about domination, which requires unity. Thus, a lie that's for the benefit of Islam is a good thing. So I think that you actually can be well informed, knowledgeable, think that what Islam is about, domination and subjection of other people, is good because they relate to the kind of God you serve, who is the greatest of all deceivers. And thus you can be intelligent and you can be honest with yourself and think that what you're doing is for the good. So I think it is actually possible. Let's see here. Prophet Yoda once said, the claim to be prophet does not make one so. Indeed. I think this is the last of the comment or questions I saved. Why every Islamic apologetic sound like a great comedian? And, well, see what my previous answer, plus add they don't have much to work with. So it doesn't matter whether it is true or not, as long as you can say it with confidence and thump your chest. And hey, what better way to show that you're confident and you don't care about what anyone thinks than to say things that are ridiculous? So I think it's kind of self-selection. Anything you want to add, Mary? Looks like we're not going to get any callers today.
guys, get them all off, because this is just not something they just hear these things and they're like, oh, you must accept it. But it's so off from any kind of possible reality. It really is.
Yeah, and Cecil says, of course, the imams in the mosque are afraid to confront the public in this day of the internet that process how ridiculous Islam is theologically and historically. And I would actually add that the average imam doesn't actually know that much. It's not required to be a scholar to be an imam, and the average imam actually is not super well educated. That's not an insult. I'm just being honest here. The kinds of people who are educated, they might take the title of sheikh, or they might not be they might not be in a mosque at all. Um, so don't confuse your local imam with being a liar, and he very well might actually be ignorant.
Yeah, it's the thing is, nobody who has ever learned the topic of where the location of Arabia, as we would write it in English, is according to the Assyrians and the Israelites and the Babylonians. Like, where do you study that in school? You don't. If you have read the Bible carefully, you'd figure it out. Like, figure out what they're talking about, right? Or if you specialize in this, you'd know. But if you're just presented different ideas, then you won't ever know what the reality is. Like, sorry guys, the language is from the north. It's from that area and that context, and is very closely related to the language of the oases there. It's called the ancient North Arabian family for a reason, for heaven's sakes.
So Masi Muslim says, how can a deceiving God state in the Quran, all those who follow Jesus will be superior till resurrection day, and those who don't will suffer terrible agony? Well, that's pretty obvious how he can say that. The so-called God of the Quran was just looking at the world around him, saw that Christians were dominant, and said that it would continue, put it in Allah's mouth 700 years prior, and pretended like it was some kind of great prophecy. So that's pretty simple. That. All right. So you want to summarize what we talked about? I know that we were going, it was about 2 hours, 15, 2.5 hours of your talk. So you want to sum it up in, I don't know, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever amount you want to take, as to what the evidence is against the Islamic belief about their own origins.
Okay, the Islamic belief about their own origins desperately misunderstands where people were when and who was where when. They have no real grasp of ancient geography because they had no idea where Abraham was. They had no idea of history beyond a certain point, so they could move things around in their minds. There's some really hilarious misplacement of history later in the Islamic sources. They put, like, people who lived in the 200s AD before Abraham, folks. This is how messed up it is. So this is just what they have is the equivalent of a guy who is from medieval Spain, who for some mysterious reason travels to France to learn modern Spanish. That is their narrative. And then somehow his descendants are magically back in Spain again a little while later. It's just absurdity. We know what Arabia was, that it was a specific location. That's where the Arabs consolidated as a people, and they were made of a collection of all of the tribes of that area. Yeah, some of them were almost certainly from Abraham. A lot of the ruling groups at various times were from Abraham, but that doesn't mean that they're all bodily from Abraham. It's a collection of tribes who had rulers at different points, who adopted other people and married their daughters off to these people, and this, that, and the other. And the tribes were not genetic at that time. It's about association, affiliation, loyalty, adoption, and everything else. So you can't say a thing about the genetic versus the identification heritage of even people like the Kedarites, like the people of Kedar who ruled Duma. you can't say what their actual bloodline was. For example, the Aaronic bloodline, the bloodline of the Kohens, the modern Hebrew Kohens, are mostly to one place, but they're not all to one place because ancient Israel had adoption. So even their prophetic bloodline had adoption inside of it. And for Allah to reject adoption and then Muhammad to insist that he must be bodily descended from Ishmael and that justifies him, when he has absolutely no evidence of this whatsoever, and he's just taking an insult of the Jews around him and trying to turn it into a prophecy, it's sheer absurdity, and none of it matches the actual facts of the matter and the actual history. A lot of things from the Bible hang together beautifully with what we know about languages and cultures and when things developed and history and all of that stuff. But the Islamic narrative doesn't hang with anything. It doesn't cohere. It doesn't make any sense with time and space and orders of events. That's basically it.
Excellent, excellent. Good summary there. Appreciate that. A couple quick humorous comments from Suyu. Imam means I am a mum. I'm actually going to take out a and just make it I am mum, as in I don't say anything, because you don't need to know everything to be an imam. And Achaemenid Sapak says, are Muslims just too good to waste their time with you because you're not worthy? I took this as a humorous comment, but then they repeated it, so I'm not sure. They might actually mean it seriously. So I'll just say yes, that the very few Muslims who actually know something, it would be a waste of their time to talk to me in comparison to trying to save the tens of thousands of Muslims who are leaving Islam because they find out this information. They're so overwhelmed trying to keep people from leaving Islam. They have no time to talk to me. In comparison, it would be a waste of their time, even from their own perspective. So I will close out in a word of prayer here in a second. I'll be back Thursday with Christian hijab. We'll be continuing our look at the blonde Muslim. Spoiler alert, despite me contacting her multiple times, offering her a chance to come on and have a friendly discussion, she didn't even reply to my messages. So I'm sure everyone is very shocked to learn that the blonde Muslim isn't interested in having a dialogue. So we'll be continuing our look at her video on how you're supposed to talk / gaslight your Christian relatives. All right, we're going to close out with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the stream today. We pray that this information will make its way into Muslim audiences, that the truth will set people free. We pray that whoever finds this stream, that they find information that is valuable to them in it. We pray that you illuminate whatever is true that was said today, that you help people perceive its truth, that you help people remember and apply it. And anything that we said that may be false is ignored or quickly forgotten. We thank you for everyone in the chat today, all those who are Christians. I ask that you continue to bless them, even though they already have a blessing beyond words in the forgiveness of their sins. For those who are not Christians, I ask that you continue to draw them back to the chat, that you open their hearts and their minds to the truth that you provide. I ask these things in Jesus' most blessed name. Amen. All right.